If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what are some cryptid/ghost/unexplained stories you'd be willing to share? One afternoon I was at work. I walked past a room with a window in the door and automatically glanced in the window. There was a woman standing in the room. Except there are only 3 people in the building and the other 2 were in the office behind me. I took a couple steps, realized what I had just seen, and backed up quickly, but by the time I got back to the window the room was empty. There was only one door, and when I opened it the room was empty. At the same building, a coworker was telling me that she was in the office right around the corner from that same room. She couldn't see the door, but she could see the shadow of the door on the floor as it slowly opened and closed. She was the only one in the building at the time and she refused to check. I arrived about an hour later and she asked me to check the door and it was still locked. I worked there about 3 years and every single one of us had stories. We heard voices in empty rooms. Once we were sitting in the office and we heard somebody breathing in an empty corner. It was common to be in one of the rooms and think somebody had just walked into the room, only to look up and find that the room was empty except for you. I had one manager who scoffed at all of our stories. She did not believe us when we told her there was something fairly benign but creepy in the building. We were sitting in the office, she scoffed and loudly said, "If there's anything in here, prove it." We all held our breath, kind of nervous, a bit scared but also curious. And just about the time my manager was getting that look on her face that said, "Ha, told you so," something was thrown out in the hallway. It took us several minutes to work up the courage before going to check and finding that a book that normally sat on a bookshelf near the front door had somehow gone from that bookshelf around the corner and halfway down the hallway. The manager never talked about it and quit shortly after that. I've since quit also, but last I heard they were still hearing voices and seeing shadows in the building. When I was 7 years old, my grandma was in the hospital dying. At the time my family was strapped for cash and my mom was pregnant, so only my dad went to California, where she lived, to see her before she died. The day that she died, we got a phone call from her with her wanting to talk to each of us saying how much she loved us. A few hours later, we got a call from family members saying that she had passed away. When we told them that we had just received a call from her a few hours prior, everybody was in disbelief, saying that she had been laying unconscious in the hospital bed all day and she could have never called, yet alone been able to articulate her thoughts to us. To this day we have no idea how she called us, and I don't think we ever will. Fayette County, Tennessee. I can't remember exactly when, but it was after Cobain died and before I changed schools, so either spring of '94 or during the '94 to '95 school year. A yellow-orange, football-shaped UFO was over a field across the road from my house. I watched it from my bedroom window while on the phone with a buddy. He used his mom's line, pre-cell phone days lol, to call the local little airport, but they said there were no helicopters or anything weird on radar. After a while, it headed east towards Somerville and I couldn't see it anymore. The next day at school, a bunch of other kids had either seen it or their uncle did, or whoever. Seriously, I would love it if anyone from that area remembers this. Unexplained story here. So I was walking home from college one afternoon. It's about a 2-mile walk between home and college. I'm on the outskirts of the town center and entering a busy neighborhood, and everything seems normal until I start getting a creepy feeling, like I was being watched or something. So I look around and what do I find? Literally every person looking at me and watching me as I go past them. Even the people driving were looking at me as they went past. Like, there was this one guy, who was turning the corner to come onto the road I was about to cross, and he was legit leaning over in his seat, staring at me as he drive around this corner. Happened for the entire way home but hasn't happened since. Was super freaked out. Didn't tell my family or friends cause they would think I'm crazy. And y'all out there saying this world ain't a simulation. 6 or so years ago weird shit started happening in my mother's apartment. I lived there alone, she was lived with her BF but kept the apartment anyway. The door to my bedroom would open or close on its own. At some point in the night, it would close, or open at random intervals. With the door handle moving and all that. And not like slowly, sometimes it would full on slam shut or open. I tried everything, closing all the windows to see if maybe it was the wind, nope. Seeing if there was anyone else in the room, never found anybody, plus the room on the other side was empty except for a wardrobe. Hell, it even happened more than a few times in front of a friend. The friend in question also told me my lamp started to switch on and off when I was sleeping. Not like in the movies where the lamp malfunctions, she said it was like it was turning on, then off, then on, etc. Toward the end of this, The sofa that was right beside the door moved by itself while I was on it, in the middle of the night, while I was on Skype on camera. The door kept opening and closing a few times a night for a few days, then it stopped. Also, I kept having sleep paralysis with visual and auditory hallucination at the time, lol. I honestly could have thought I was simply going crazy, but I had eyewitnesses. Never understood what happened this week. Never happened again. At my old middle school, I would have volleyball practice twice a week in the evenings. My sisters, 2 years older and 5 years older, did the same thing at my age. I remember going to return the volleyballs upstairs for my coach one night into her classroom, which was 2 stories above the gym. I made it up the stairs and saw the door for the class across the hallway start to slowly open and a really bright light and smoke or something slowly drifting out, almost dancing. I booked it downstairs and waited a little bit until my coach could walk up with me. The door was shut like nothing happened. About 8 or so years later, I was talking with my sister, 2 years older than me, about what I saw, and I was half expecting her to think I was being crazy. I go into detail, telling her what it looked like, which classroom and door and everything. She wasn't responding to me, so I looked over at her for the first time in a couple minutes and she was crying. She told me she saw the exact same thing too and couldn't go back upstairs alone ever again. She was relieved to finally find out that she wasn't making it up in her head or being crazy. We thought of all the possibilities of what it could be. Custodians cleaning with the lights on and maybe smoking? But nope, it was too bright for any normal lights in there and way too dark outside for it to be shining through any window. Plus, the custodians would always clean after school and before our practices. School was done by 2:30 and practice was always 6:30 to 8:30. We've heard many other stories from other kids at the school who had after school activities and would see/hear weird shit. Still creeps us both out to this day. My grandpa lived in an extremely rural, undeveloped area in the 40s, 50s when this occurred. Every time he would walk to school in the early morning, it would be pitch black, especially in the winter. There was this huge, old, unoccupied house that he'd walk by each morning, and each morning he'd see the entire house light up as if there were automatic lights or someone inside flipping all the light switches. The thing was, it was an ancient house in which no one lived, but more important, electric lights in every room weren't a widespread thing where he lived, even in houses with living occupants. Another one, my dad, his 2 brothers, and his parents, his father was the grandpa who walked by the haunted house, had their share of poverty at certain points in my dad's childhood. To the point where my grandpa ate shortening and cucumber sandwiches to save money. To the point where the family went fishing in the nearby lake so they could have dinner. Which takes us into our next story. They were fishing for a good while with no bites. Suddenly, this random man appeared with a tiny fishing box, set up right next to them, and started to fish. My grandpa would always emphasize how small the fishing box was because he'd say the man took out a bucket, bait, tackle, etc. from it, like he was Mary Poppins. He very quickly pulled in a lot of fish. Then, according to my grandpa, he pulled out a big knife and a board, cut and cleaned the fish, pulled out a big box, put the cleaned fish inside, gave the box to my grandpa, and just left. They never saw him again. My grandparents and my dad think it was Jesus. I don't know what my uncles think, I've never talked to them about it. Not sure of the veracity of these stories, but at least with the second one there were 3 people who very earnestly told me the same story. I got home from school one day and decided to play a game on my computer. During intermission in the game, I would talk in a group chat with a couple of my friends. We were telling jokes and making each other laugh until I needed to use the restroom. I told them I would be right back and left my phone on the desk and didn't turn it off. When I returned, I noticed that some of the letters were being pressed even though no one was in the room with me. It wasn't a word that was typed, but random letters with the @ symbol spacing them out. To me, it didn't mean anything, so I asked my friends if they thought it meant something, but they were startled by it and didn't know what it meant either. I thought it was strange, but decided to ignore it. Later that night when I decided to go to bed, I turned off my lamp and got under the sheets. My cat, Portia, was by me sound asleep. A few moments later, I heard what sounded like footsteps slowly creeping through the hallway to my bedroom. Suddenly, they stopped right outside my doorway. I glanced up and expected to see my brother, but no one was in sight. From her dead sleep, Portia bolted up, stood at the end of my bed and stared into the hallway. I was confused since she had never done that before. I tried to get her back to her normal spot on my bed, but she wouldn't budge. I even put my hand in front of her face, but she kept trying to peer over it. She eventually sat back down and went to bed. Since then, I haven't had any other experiences like that, and I still wonder if there was something trying to contact me that night. About a decade ago, I was visiting a graveyard to pay my respects. This was back in my family's home country. I was feeling absolutely fine throughout the day, but come time to leave the graveyard, I suddenly felt like I couldn't walk by myself. My shoulders were extremely heavy, my body was drained, and my legs felt like they were being anchored down by weights, more specifically, hands. It was as if I had multiple hands grabbing me by the ankles, so I couldn't keep walking. I actually felt quite panicked, so I told the family member I was with that I'm literally feeling like my life forces, for lack of better translation, are being sucked out of me, to which they nonchalantly replied, well, they probably want your young, lively spirit. In the end, I had to be carried out of the premises. One day I was with my brother and we both walked out our house and started walking down the street at about 11 to 12 p.m. All of a sudden, about 5 meters away from us, a woman in a white dress just straight up walked into the wall and disappeared. I had no clue to where she came from, and I didn't recognize who she was. I couldn't see her face as we saw her from her side profile, but she had dark, long black hair. I was frozen still for about 2 to 3 seconds and then turned to my brother to ask him he just saw that. I looked over at him and he was also frozen and replied with a yeah. We both just walked immediately back into our house and decided not to go out that night. Apparently, a few other people on my street have seen something similar, but for me it was only that one time. There was a really weird occurrence at my dad's house a few years ago. He awoke to the sound of dogs barking and realized the neighborhood dogs were barking at something that was moving parallel to the road. When his own started to bark, he went outside to see what was up. Across the street is pretty much all forest except a church directly across the street that at the time was just a gravel lot. My dad was too far away to see anything, but in the dead of night, he could definitely hear the sound of someone running at full tilt across the gravel. A few things freaked him out from this. 1. Whatever it was definitely ran on 2 feet. Try having a dog run on gravel versus a human and you can tell the difference. And it was big. Both myself and he have witnessed large animals like bears and moose running through the underbrush, and according to him, it sounded like it was of a similar size to those creatures. 2. It was easily running somewhere around 40 to 50 miles per hour in the clearing of the lot, then slowed down again as it went back into the woods. He was able to compare the speed because the road itself is 45 miles per hour limit, so it was going just as fast as a passing car. 3. The final thing. Its huffing and gasping was so loud he could hear it from his front door and was obviously not human. We looked online later to compare its sound to other animals, and it really didn't sound like anything he'd ever heard before. The freakiest part was the almost synchronous reactions the dogs had. He's never heard dogs react like that before. Both him, my stepmom, my stepbrother, and several of our neighbors all can account for hearing the strange barking from the dogs, but it was only my dad who heard what they were after. Nothing happened like that since, and I've never personally witnessed anything like it. We do like right on the border of the Cascade Mountain Range and are surrounded by park and federal land if you want to get an idea of where this took place. It was a rainy winter morning. My father and I were pulling out of the driveway headed to school. We both saw a glimpse of a girl in a white dress, barefoot, blonde, maybe 5 years old, run around the corner of our home and out of sight. We both looked at each other and acknowledged that we witnessed the same thing. He got out of the car and ran around the house to look for her. When he came back, he said he couldn't find anyone but called my mom to let her know that a little kid might be running around the yard. We thought it was weird, but not much was said of it. And there weren't any missing kids in the area. A few months later, we were remodeling our basement and found a photo album hidden behind the drywall. It was full of photos of a little girl with blonde hair and a white dress. The photo album was from 1922. The family that originally lived in the house died of TB. One night I was watching The Conjuring at home with my little sister when we heard someone putting a key into our front door and opening it. We were sitting in the living room next to a sliding door that was very close to the front door, so we both heard it very clearly. Now this didn't alarm us since we knew our dad had recently gone out to get some stuff, so we just assumed he had returned. "Dad, you're back already?" I casually asked. There was no response. "Dad?" I asked again, thinking that he had not heard me the first time. Again, silence. At this point I get the feeling that something isn't quite right, and I could tell by the look on my sister's face that she was quite nervous as well. I'll note that up to this point she had spent the evening rolling her eyes at horror movie cliches, and she very rarely gets scared. We looked at each other for a moment, wondering what we should do before we started hearing a few more scattering sounds from right outside the sliding door. I was frozen in fear by this stage. I tried one more time in a louder, But shake your voice, Dad, is that you? Please respond, please respond. Repeated in my head. But the silence continued. Now at this point I'm freaking out and I literally jumped off the couch. My sister also abruptly gets up and starts rapidly walking towards the other end of the room which leads to the kitchen area. She later revealed to me that she was planning on grabbing a knife. She had this horrified look on her face that I hadn't seen before. We looked at each other in nervous silence. I didn't really know what to do and I didn't want to make any further sounds. I finally decided to walk up to the sliding door and began opening it as slowly as possible. Peering into the darkness, I literally became the idiot who investigates the unknown, creepy noise without anything to protect myself with. When the door was finally open wide enough, I poked my head out and scanned the corridor, preparing for the worst. To my surprise, there was no one there. But what was more strange was that the front door was still completely shut. We never heard the door close. My sister and I were obviously both extremely relieved as we were almost certain that there was an intruder in the house. After this, I immediately went to go ask my mom, who was situated in her bedroom at the other end of our house, if it was her or whether she had noticed anything. She told me that she thought my dad had come home as well as she also heard someone opening the front door. Around half an hour later, which felt like an eternity at the time as we still quite shaken from the incident, my dad finally arrived home and confirmed that he had not come home earlier. To this day my sister and I still have no idea what happened that night. I made a throwaway to post this because people know my main and it's kind of embarrassing and I've only told my partner because I'm definitely the type who rolls my eyes at ghost stories and holds firm on the stance that I don't believe in ghosts. And yet, I have 2 brothers and we all lived in a small house when I was about 8 to 11 years old. All of us kids hated the downstairs. It was always chilly, which is normal for a basement, but it felt like a creepy chilly. Sounds lame, I know, but my little brother, probably 6 when we first had that house, had a room downstairs and hated it. Would go so far as to not sleep in his room because he was so frightened. He wouldn't even enter the basement bathroom. He always had awful nightmares in that house, and so did I. All of us kids still refer to it as the haunted house. It sounds stupid to type, but it just truly had a bad feeling to it. Anyways, the incident, I was about 11 and downstairs alone. There was like a 45-minute gap between getting off school and when my mom got home, and my brothers weren't there, must have been with my dad? Can't quite remember. So I was on the computer, which was in the basement. And to my left is the staircase heading up and my cat was sitting on the landing between the first set of stairs and the second. It's also only about 4 p.m., so it was light out and I had no music playing, so there was nothing to confuse me. This next part will probably sound minor and not freaky, but I get chills thinking of it. Suddenly, I hear hi starting as a whisper and getting progressively louder and circling the room, as though someone was running around. I might have chalked it up to me hearing something I guess, except when the hi got to the staircase, directly to my left, my cat arched her back and hissed loudly. I fucking bolted upstairs, my cat following me, and never went down solo again until we moved into our next house. Couple of years ago our TV started behaving really weirdly. It started with just pausing, fast forwarding and rewinding what we were watching, flicking through channels or changing the volume by itself. Then it gradually stepped up to putting horror movies on and entering the pin normally required for films rated above PG by itself. We changed the pin and then we would see the pin being typed in correctly 3 times. Then it started flashing random pictures on the screen. One it did a lot was cat's eyes, don't remember the rest. Have no idea how it got access to the pictures either. I doubt these random pictures would be stored anywhere in the TV. We called out the TV company multiple times and they thought we were crazy until they came out and saw it for themselves. No one could figure out what it was, they kept recording what it was doing and sending it around and nobody knew what was causing it or how to fix it. In the end we had to get a new box. Not had anything like that happen since and still have no clue what caused it, but it was terrifying at the time. This is from the time I was 13, I remember it clearly because it happened the day I found my cat. That day I returned home kinda early from school, because I used to return walking but that day I took the bus. So, nobody was at home at that hour except of me. I was eating something before taking a nap and the phone started ringing. I answered the call, but there wasn't any sound in the other side. I hung up and was about to go when it started ringing again. I answered and nothing, so I hung up again. That happened many times in a period of 20 to 25 minutes. The phone started ringing for the 10th time, I think, and I was angry at that point because I thought someone was making a prank, but no. This time when I answered there was someone, and that someone was crying, and in the background there was a very creepy and, believe me, inhuman laugh. It sounded metallic. Just after I asked how can I help you? I heard that the person who was crying started to shout something that wasn't in my language. Then it stopped. Then I heard the laugh sounded closer, and at that point I was super scared and just hung up the phone in shock. It was a minute later I realized that maybe I had witnessed a crime or something similar, so I started checking the call record to tell the police what number was the one calling. It was empty, no calls that day. I was astonished. Then I called the police and informed about it. They called me hours later very angry, telling me that they contacted the phone company and there wasn't any call to my phone at the hour I pointed this thing to have happened. Until today I don't know what the hell happened, like I'm trying to seek an explanation to this. My time to shine. I often have trouble sleeping. It gets to the point that I sometimes go walking my dogs at 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the morning and coming home to go back to sleep. I am convinced there is some sort of strange creature living in my quiet country Australian town. If you doubt my story, look back on my post history. I went on r/find our Reddit a while back looking for a sub to post the following story but never did. So anyways, when I get to the sports ground in my town I usually let my dogs off the leash so they can have a run around free. They're violent to other dogs, so it's good for them to get out and run around like that. One night I get to the sports ground and let off my dogs and shone the torch around to see if anyone was around. I looked around and all of a sudden I saw two eyes illuminated by my torch staring back at me from the middle of the oval. This didn't happen at the oval pictured, it's just to show you what a footy oval is. At first I thought it was a dog/cat/rabbit/possum, but then it stood up. Whatever it was big. I thought maybe it was a kangaroo, but it stood way higher than any kangaroo I had seen. Even a red. I couldn't really make out its body cause it was pretty far away. Like I said before, my dogs are mean and violent to other animals. They've been known to take on animals way bigger than themselves like cows and horses, but to whatever this thing was, they backed away to me and whimpered. I took them away on the leash and kept walking. We went through a gate and halfway across the second oval, I got that strange feeling something was watching us and turned around to shine the torch. And it was there. It had walked to another gate that led into the same area and was just standing there watching us. It was still too far to make out its body and I was really scared, so I just started walking and in 5 minutes I was home. That was about a year ago. It took me a month to work up the nerve to walk the dogs at night again. Last month I was in the same place at the same time with my dogs when I started thinking about the incident. As I was thinking, every dog in the surrounding neighborhood started barking like crazy. My two started whimpering like the first time, and all of a sudden a giant bang sounded and something let out a large threatening howl which made all the dogs suddenly stop. As soon as that happened I grabbed the dogs and ran home. I'm convinced there is some sort of strange creature living there. When I was about 10 or 12, I went to this camping/resort place. I won't name the exact place, but I will say it was in New England. In this resort, you rented out a cabin or RV and you slept in it. The place has a pool and things like that, but the majority of the place was forested. The forest wasn't dense, but it was pretty large and you could easily get lost. The day the sighting happened was just off. Everything just felt weird. Weirdly enough, there wasn't a lot of cicadas or birds singing, even though it was the middle of July. It was like the sky was dead. The fishing was horrible too. Literally no one caught anything. It was like the water was dead as well. Pretty boring day. The pool was fun though, haha. It got even worse when night hit. Everyone else went to sleep, and I stayed up to watch some TV. After a while, I heard some scurrying outside. I really liked animals at that age, still do, so I went to the window to see whatever critter was romping through the leaves. Needless to say, it wasn't a coon or a possum. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't natural at all. This thing was really long and skinny. I guess you could call its body dog-like, kinda looked like a greyhound. It was completely hairless. There wasn't even any peach fuzz like a Sphinx cat. Its face was the worst part. It was like the mix of a wolf and a baboon. Its eyes were just black marbles. It stared at me through the window. It was crouching then, it looked like it was digging through the dirt. After a few minutes it stood up. It was bipedal, like a person. The thing must have been like 7 feet tall, it was huge. It ran away after that. I woke up the next morning. I thought that I dreamt the whole thing. I went outside to where I saw the thing. The leaves were disturbed and there was a bare spot of dirt. I never saw that thing again. Anyone know what this can be? So this story is something my mother told me. When my sister was a baby, my mother had to take her with her to the DMV one winter. This was the Midwest, so the DMV was quite a ways away. While they're driving in the middle of nowhere, the car dies. Now, this is the Midwest during winter. Temperature was a balmy 5°F. There was a snowstorm with strong winds, so visibility was low, and even if you could see, there was nothing but corn and soy fields for miles. My mother is quietly panicking, thinking that she and my baby sister were about to freeze to death. Then in the rear view mirror she sees a figure. There is a man, on foot, approaching the car. He walks up to my mother's window and asks her if she needs help. He looks under her hood for about 5 minutes, and the car starts again. The man then just turned and disappeared into the snowstorm. My mother had the car driving down the road seconds later and never saw any man or any buildings he might have gone into. There was absolutely no reason for a man like that to be walking in the middle of a snowstorm, fix a car with no tools provided, and then disappear. My mother maintains to this day that that man must have been a guardian angel. When I was about 14, my grandmother had given me this little gold necklace with a cross on it and told me never to take it off. I wore it for at least 12 straight years without taking it off, but one day finally decided to, and then it got lost. So by this time I'm in my 20s and my brother and I were living together. One night we stayed up late playing with a Ouija board. Nothing significant happened during the game, but we started talking about our deceased grandmother and I told him about the necklace and how I was sad that I had lost it. At this point it was missing for a couple of years and I had moved twice. Anyway, we eventually decided to call it a night. I go to my room to get into bed, but first I was digging through my backpack looking for something, and I find the necklace in there in the front pocket, plain as day. It made no sense. I got really excited, so I went to tell my brother, who also thought it was eerie. Then we proceed to get back to getting to bed. As I'm laying in my bed about to drift off, feeling content about finding the necklace, I hear a very loud bang on my door as if a full-grown man had punched it. It scared the absolute shit out of me. I thought maybe it was my brother, so went to check, but when I opened the door no one was there. I checked his room and he was sound asleep. No idea or theory if the Ouija board, necklace and bang are related in any way, but it was a weird night to say the least. When I was 18, 2008, a friend and I took a road trip from Northern California to International Falls, Minnesota. It was a long drive and we were broke, so we tried to make it as fast as possible. Our goal was 2 days to make the 2,015-mile drive. Toward the end of day 2, we had been driving for about 20 hours and had about 2 left. We were in the middle of nowhere at about 2 a.m. when we saw this bright blue light way off in the distance. We thought somebody had been pulled over or something, kinda looked like blue police lights and really bright. The light seemed impossibly far though and took forever for us to come across. When we got to the light, it wasn't a car. There was a woman standing in the middle of a creek with some crazy bright blue light all around her. She was just standing there, in the middle of nowhere, in far northern Minnesota. It was the most bizarre thing I had ever seen. The light seemed to be emanating from her. It freaked us out, so we just hurried away. We didn't talk about it the rest of the trip and eventually lost contact. I messaged him about it a couple of years back because it had always stuck with me and wanted to make sure it wasn't a dream. Turns out he remembered the same thing and said he wished he forgot. I looked into it further and turns out a flood had washed away a small town a bunch of years ago and resulted in many people dying. We're not the only ones to see what we saw that night. It was back in 2002 or so. I was living just outside of town in rural South Carolina. My house was bordering on an old forest. I was young and curious. It was about 8 p.m. or so. It left the house because it'd gotten into a fight with my older sister. I wandered in one direction for a good 10 minutes, looking at trees and so forth. And I just stumbled on this old tombstone. It was so old and weathered. I couldn't see anything on it. I look around and there are 4 more to my left. 3 to my right. Behind it was what I now knew as a dilapidated church, or maybe a remnant of one. It seemed so small. My sister managed to catch up to me and was trying to drag me back to the house. She was mad at first, but then she glanced behind me at what I thought was the tombstone. The color drained from her face and she began yanking on my arm to pull me away. I was mad at first, but when I looked back to see the graves one last time, that's when I saw it. That thing staring at us from the ruins behind the tombstones. Most I remember about it was that its head was made of a skull. A goat skull, because it had horns. I booked it and never went back. We moved out 2 months later because the hotel my mom worked for shut down due to financial issues. Every time I try and talk to my sister about it, she says it had to be a dream, but I know the look she gets. She saw it too. To this day I'll never know what it was. There is a house not far from where I grew up that is kind of on its own on a fairly large lot. This house looks actually quite nice on the outside, aside from clearly having been uninhabited for quite some time. This house invokes in both my younger brother and myself a visceral terror. For not discernible reason. Neither of us have ever been inside this house, nor known anyone who has. Yet, we both have very clear memories of playing hide and go seek in the basement of this house, well, as clear as we possibly can, having never been inside. We both, with no actual proof, know we have been in that house, and it was one of the most terrifying experiences we have ever had. All of our relatives confirm that we have never been in that house. And yet, even now, 25 plus years after this memory takes place, even driving past that house gives me the willies. Oh, I've been waiting to tell this one. When I was younger, my family and I would go overseas to visit relatives. There was a guest house known as our Haveli, nearby my grandma's house, where my siblings, myself and our cousins would play at. For work-related purposes, people would come and go for tea and stay at the site. Meanwhile, us kids would just run around crazy everywhere, especially the rooftop. We never saw anything strange, but sometimes the guests staying over would hear children's laughter coming from the rooftop at night when no one was there. They even reported being slapped by someone when asleep. Over time, it became abandoned as there was a new place built nearby for the visitors. Only my grandma went to the old Haveli to grow some crops, but she stopped doing that too as the entire building slowly started sinking. The place was messy and covered in dust, and my uncle then decided to remove all the furniture from the rooms. He sent a couple of workers to the Haveli just after evening, but not long after they came back running, saying they saw something. My uncle thought they were joking and dismissed them, and a few days later at the same time, sent new people to get the furniture out. The new workers came back out as well. In their words, they described how when they went into the room, they only saw smoke everywhere, and on the bed were two women sitting, one smaller than the other. They were covered head to toe in black burqas similar to a hijab, but the whole face is covered. The room was locked, and there was no window for them to get through. High brick walls also surround the whole house. My uncle and the others still don't know what they were. Also, the Haveli is just opposite from the local cemetery, which might explain the occurrence. I think it was ball lighting, but it's weird my girlfriend at the time didn't see it. We're walking through a school playground near a creek probably between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. Walking my dog. I saw from a distance a light source zipping around in circles. Since it was dark, I just assumed it was someone else playing with their dog. It's a common dog spot, with a flashlight or something. I couldn't see the source, but I figured since my GF didn't mention it, she probably the same as me. Eventually she notices my head is moving, watching this light move around. I was unbothered she didn't see it because she needed glasses and she didn't have them. As we approached the flat portion of the playground, my dog approached the ball of light and seemed unbothered by it. Seemed to look at it but went back to sniffing around. Eventually we walked among the ball of light and it continued to circle around us. Once my ex asked me to point out where the light was. It disappeared. Once we got about 30 meters away, it briefly reappeared and disappeared again, but we got into a more well-lit area and I think my eyes adjusted. I think it's ball lighting by the research I did shortly after. Some of criteria for conditions were right. It was damp, slightly foggy. My mom also has a great story about my sister and I. Both when we hit 2 years old, we apparently said bye-bye grandma/grandpa bye-bye to the same corner in our kitchen. My mom has some mental illnesses. Bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, depression, and a couple more. She stopped taking her meds when I was about 15-16ish. She said they didn't help, plus they wouldn't prescribe one pill that she needed. She would joke about there being demons in her room. They would talk to her and shit. Move stuff. Well, my mom worked third shift at the time. So when she left for work, I'd go to her room and sleep in her bed. It was the only room besides my older brother's room that had a lock on it that worked, including our front and back door. I'm in the house by myself. My mom and brother left for work. They worked at the same place. I'm in her bed about to sleep and I feel something slowly pull the cover off of me. I panicked and pulled it over my head. I didn't move. You know how you can feel the presence of someone when they are close enough to touch you, but don't touch you? I felt that hovering over me. Something was there. It didn't touch me, but it felt dark and heavy above me. I was so terrified. I remember telling my mom about it when she came home. She laughed and said that was her demons. I have too. I swear to God I am neither nuts, nor stupid/gullible. My great-grandmother's house was famous in our family. Doors opened and closed without human intervention. My nana insisted my uncle's cradle rocked itself. As a children, the whole house made the hair on my body stand on end. After my great-grandma died and my grandparents were preparing to sell the house, my grandpa was doing some work in the dining room and removed some plaster, only to discover the inside of all of the walls were lined with opium bottles. My great-grandma and her husband were running a speakeasy during the 20s. We assumed some mayhem occurred. The next, my best friend and her family moved to a new house they built a bit in the middle of nowhere when I was maybe 13. We used to sleep over in their bonus room, me, her little sibs, and whatever other friends were around. I distinctly remember waking up in the middle of the night and finding a little boy standing at the foot of my sleeping bag. None of us were little boys. It happened more than once, over a couple of years. I wasn't the only one who saw him, so we, being 13 and convinced we were in a Nancy Drew novel, went to the local library and looked up the area. A house had burned down on their lot 30 years ago, a 6-year-old boy had died in the fire. So yeah.